Did you know there was a time when children could legally smoke cigarettes? Or when doctors actually recommended heroin as medicine? Yup, the past was wild. In today's video, we're diving into 10 more jaw-dropping things that used to be totally legal. Number 10. Lobotomies. Have you ever seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest? It shows how lobotomies were once seen as a valid way to treat mental illness. This procedure, which involved damaging parts of the brain, was used for everything from schizophrenia and depression to homosexuality and even backaches. Lobotomies became common in the early 20th century and could even be done without the person's consent. The US was a major player, performing between 40,000 and 50,000 of these surgeries. Even though lobotomies were banned in 1967, reports say they still happened into the 1980s. It's shocking to think about how damaging brain surgery was used to fix mental health issues, especially when the procedure itself often caused more problems. Number 9. Drinking and driving. Drunk driving has been illegal almost as long as cars have existed, with a major crackdown happening in the 1970s. But drinking while driving was a different story. It wasn't until the 1990s that laws against having an open container of alcohol in your car became common in the US. Even now, about half a dozen states still allow open containers in cars. So while driving drunk has been a no-no for a while, you used to be able to drink in your car. It wasn't until 1998 that federal open container laws were introduced to stop people from chugging beer while driving. These laws aim to prevent dangerous driving, but only 39 states fully enforce all 6 federal rules. States like Wyoming, Alaska, Louisiana, and Tennessee have their own laws, but they aren't as strict. It's crazy to think about how drinking and driving used to be handled so differently, right? Number 8. Narcotics. How some substances went from being everyday medicines to being heavily regulated. Back in the day, LSD, cocaine, and meth were totally legal. It's wild to think about how these substances, which are now illegal, were once seen as remedies for all sorts of issues. Doctors actually prescribed them for things like obesity and mental health problems. But as abuse became uncontrollable, most countries had to ban them. Meth is a prime example of how things changed. It used to be a normal part of the pharmacy lineup in the US. You could get it to treat stuff like alcoholism, depression, or even seasonal allergies before we had Claritin, approved by the FDA in 1944 and called methadone in 1950s. It quickly became popular because of its addictive nature. The abuse got so out of hand that the government had to step in with Controlled Substances Act. Now you can only get it in tiny doses. It's pretty wild to think how much things have shifted. Number 7. Open immigration. Ever thought about how different your experiences might be under different immigration policies? Also called free migration, open immigration is essentially immigration without much oversight or government interference. It might seem unthinkable today, but for many countries and continents, this was the norm by necessity. Monitoring and patrolling large borders or posts simply wasn't helpful without a large population or more advanced automated surveillance. While some nations still allow open immigration today, most countries have opted for stricter control on who is allowed over their borders. This shift is due to rising populations, increased mobility, more competition for employment, and security concerns. Number 6. Underage marriage. Child marriage has been a widespread practice throughout history, often involving an older man marrying a younger girl. The specifics of these marriages varied depending on religion, region, and culture. Typically, such marriages occurred after the girl reached puberty, which was seen as a sign that she could bear children. Even today, child marriage remains illegal in many parts of the world. In places like the US and Canada, you can still legally marry at 16 in some areas, though parental approval is often required. However, many countries have taken steps to ban child marriage. International efforts and local laws are increasingly pushing for higher minimum marriage ages to protect young people from these outdated practices. Isn't it strange how some practices are slow to evolve with time? Number 5. Forced castrations. Throughout history, neutering men through physical injury or chemical means was quite common. Castration was often used to create eunuchs, who were seen as ideal servants for female masters due to their lack of sex drive. It was also employed as a punishment for criminals and political dissidents. Thankfully, today this practice is widely considered cruel and unusual. However, it remains legal in some places as a severe punishment for crimes like child molestation or rape. Did you know that entire groups of people like the eunuchs and castrati lived their lives as victims of forced castration? This practice wasn't just legal, but surprisingly common. For instance, homosexuality was often treated with chemical castration, and the famous computer scientist Alan Turing chose castration over imprisonment for being gay in 1952, when homosexuality was still illegal. Even now, some US states use chemical castration for severe child rape cases, with California and Florida being examples. Number 4. Segregation. Segregation was a period when people in the US were legally separated by race. Mostly from the late 1800s until the 1960s, black and white people had different schools, restaurants, and even drinking fountains. It's shocking to think about how divided things were, isn't it? The separate but equal rule was meant to make things fair, but it actually just reinforced inequality and kept people apart. For instance, black students were stuck in poorly funded schools, while the white students went to schools with plenty of resources. The fight to end segregation was led by brave individuals who faced incredible challenges. It's hard to imagine living in such a divided world, but their courage brought about real change. Even so, the effects of that era still exist today. Number 3. Marital rape. Back in the day, a woman was seen as a legal minor under the husband's control, kind of like how a father would be her guardian. Up until the 20th century, the legal system had this rule called coverture, where a woman's rights were pretty much taken over by her husband once they got married. This meant women had very few rights or independence outside of marriage and couldn't easily take legal actions if their husbands assaulted them. It wasn't until the 1970s that people started seriously talking about making marital rape a crime. But it wasn't officially outlawed until 1993. Even now, the penalties for it vary by state. For example, South Carolina only prosecutes sexual violence if it's deemed of a high and aggravated nature. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, many states had something called the rule of thumb, where a man could legally beat his wife with an instrument no wider than his thumb. Crazy, right? Although some states started to outlaw domestic violence by the late 1800s, many still saw it as a private issue between a man and his wife. Even if domestic abuse was penalized, action usually required a witness. It wasn't until the 1970s that women's groups pushed society and the government to recognize how serious this issue was, with the first battered women's shelter opening in 1974. Hard to believe it was less than 30 years ago. Number 2. Child labor and abuse. Did you know that child labor and abuse went largely unchecked in the US until the mid-20th century? Childhood in the US used to be much tougher. Child labor and child slavery were widespread throughout American history. Factory owners preferred to hire children because they were less likely to join unions or strike. It's hard to picture kids working in mines, farms, or textile mills as part of their daily lives, but that was the reality for many. Most states didn't have laws to limit child labor back then. Regulation of child labor didn't start until 1938, but addressing child abuse took even longer. It wasn't until 1974 that the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act came into play, covering all types of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional, severe neglect, and more. It really highlights the progress we've made, even though there's always more to do. Number 1. Murder. How did ancient cultures manage justice for murder and how we ended up with today's laws? Back in the day, especially in ancient and medieval times, things were very different. For example, living in ancient Rome or Greece, where the idea of justice was not as clear-cut as it is today, if someone was killed, it wasn't always about following strict laws like we have now. Sometimes it was about personal revenge or settling scores. In medieval Europe, things were even wilder, where you could get away with a lot more if you had the right connections or if it was considered an honorable act. Feuds between families or tribes were common, and what was considered legal often depended on local customs rather than formal laws. It wasn't until around the 18th and 19th centuries that the concept of murder and homicide became more regulated and formalized. The rise of modern legal systems started putting clear boundaries on what was acceptable, making it much more to justify or get away with such acts. Looking back reminds us how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. So what do you think future generations will say about the practices we accept today? Thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts below and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.